Welcome back to SelfiGaming. SelfSustained here again. Today we're going to do another how-to. As you may have seen if you've been following it all, I just got my mage to 100, so it's time to do a few more talent and rotation guides. We're going to go through and kind of give you an idea of how I set up my mage, and then I will also run through the other two talent specs just to give you a brief overview of what Icy Veins suggests, as I use Icy Veins as my resource for a starter point. Again, I don't recommend anybody to follow these as a concrete set. This is the only way to do it, but it's a very good starting point. So let's start with my buff watch over here in the top left corner. As you can see, Arcane Brilliance. Just make sure you got that staying up. That infuses you with Brilliance, increasing spell power by 10%, critical strike by 5% for 1 hour, and it works for your entire party and raid. I also have a few other buffs up here. You will see that I have Ice Barrier, which is my little shield, which I'll get into that a little bit more whenever we get into talents. I keep that up there so I can keep an eye on making sure that I still have it on when I need it. Greater Invisibility. Actually, it might just be Invisibility because I don't think I talented for that. Invisibility, which I don't hardly ever use, but it's nice for a get out of dodge. And then last but not least is your Slow Fall, which is great for keeping yourself from dying because you fell over a cliff. And it's also useful for party and raid members as well. So in this mage, I specialized in Arcane. I leveled as an Arcane. It's probably not the best leveling spec. I think I read a lot of places saying that Frost was probably the best leveling spec since you have your little pet to help out and kind of keep them off of you. But I found that if I can keep the enemies at bay, keep them away from me, mainly target them from a distance and burn them down before they get to me, Arcane was super easy. As an Arcane Mage, you have particularly amazing single target damage. They have been nerfed recently. They used to be basically top of the DPS rankings list, but anymore they're 5 or 6 down. Maybe best in slot might even drop them a little bit more, but they're still in the top 10 by all means. Thing about Arcane Mage is, though it is relatively easy to learn, easy to pick up, and it feels like, especially in higher gear ratings, probably very boring or mundane because you're just primarily spamming Arcane Blast. But in order to use it properly and efficiently, it is quite hard to master. So with that said, we're going to switch into showing the talents. As you can see my build here, at level 15, tier 1, I went with Evanesce, which is basically a replacement for Ice Block, which is, again, a nice mitigation. It's not very long. It's only a 3-second mitigation, but it avoids all attacks in that time. And it's not affected by the global cooldown, which is helpful, meaning that you don't have to wait for the global cooldown to reset before you can use it. You can use it even in an emergency. At tier 2, level 30, I went with Ice Barrier, again, as I'd mentioned up here. It's a nice little shield that absorbs a fair amount of damage. It'll help you stay alive a little bit longer, especially if you didn't succeed at getting them burnt down before they made it to you. Before I continue on, I probably ought to at least touch on the other options on these first 2 tiers, as I neglected to in the first tier. The other options were Ice Flows, which was another idea for tier 1. They don't really suggest Blazing Speed for an Arcane Mage, but Ice Flows is a decent one for the additional movement speeds. And the fact that it has 3 charges makes it quite useful. But overall, between the 3, Evanesce is probably your best because you do take a lot of damage quickly and you need all the mitigation you can get. Tier 2, the other options were Alter Time. Let you read that. And Flame Glow. Again, this tier's basically survival talents, and none of them really have a clear lead on the others. so it's really a bit of a user's choice. So for myself, I need the mitigation. I need to stay alive, so I went with Ice Barrier. At level 45 in Tier 3 talents, you have the choices of Ring of Frost, Frost Jaw, and Ice Ward. And here we go again. Ice Ward I used simply because of the mitigation. It allows me to throw an Ice Ward on myself or another friendly, and anytime in the next 3 melee attacks will trigger a Frost Nova, which allows me a chance to get out of dodge. At level 60, Tier 4, the choices were Greater Invisibility, Cold Snap, and Cauterize. Cauterize seems to be leading the pack here a little bit. You also could go with Greater Invisibility, but where I don't really use it that often, Cauterize is a nice passive, and basically what it does, as you can read here, says that if I at one point was to die from the damage taken, it will not kill me, but instead heal me to 35% health, at which then it will burn 28% of that back down over the next 6 seconds. Problem with it is it can only occur once every 2 minutes. So once it's happened, it's nice for that, oh crap, I just screwed up and I'm about to die. Well, it's going to give you a couple more seconds beforehand. As long as you can burn them down quickly. Otherwise, it's really, they're all a bit of a waste. Cold Snap has a nice reset of the cooldown. I'm thinking about switching over to that simply for the idea of the additional Evanesce, Presence of Mind, and Frost Nova spells, plus that additional 22% healing. But it's got a 3-minute cooldown, and it just makes it that much harder to use. Still a decent option. So like I said, I'm thinking about switching to Cold Snap, but for the moment I'm still in Cauterize. At level 75 in the Tier 5 talents, we've got Nether Tempest, Unstable Magic, and Supernova. Now this tier is first of 2 tiers that really are dependent on which way you like to play. Myself, I like Supernova simply because I've always liked the Frost Nova concept, the idea of doing some pretty neat crowd control and damage at one time. Well, Supernova really expands on that, causes a pulse of energy around the target, which does damage to that target as well as all enemies within 8 yards. And it knocks them upward, which is essentially another interrupt, a spell interrupt, if you will. And you can use it up to 2 charges at a time. The other option here would have been Nether Tempest. I haven't yet done this, so not experienced with it yet, but from what I read, Nether Tempest is better on sustainable damage versus burst damage from Supernova. So in a situation where you're raiding and you've got some big mobs to burn down and they got a lot of health points, you might be better off at Nether Tempest than you would Supernova. But at this point, I just hit 100, and my gear, well, I'm going to open it up here, my gear is only at 593. I'm not even broke the 600 point yet, so I think I'm fine with the burst damage. Tier 6 at level 90, you have the options of Mirror Image, which unfortunately used to be awesome, but these days are pretty well just pointless. You could also use Incanter's Flow, or what I went with, which is Rune of Power. Rune of Power is basically a nice self buff that you can place at any given time. You can have up to 2 of them at a time even. So I'll drop a second one to show that. And as long as I stand within 8 yards of that, you see this little buff up here that increases my spell damage by 15%. 4 is the length of time that the Rune of Power is dropped. Now, with that said, you can place those, and it's suggested to place those before you even attempt to pull a target. And in a dungeon and raid situation, you would want to drop at least one before you pulled even trash, more or less a boss. On a boss, you drop both of them, giving yourself a bit of a room, and that way you can jump back and forth between them like so, maintaining that buff the whole time. Allows for a little bit of movement in case some environmental hazards come your way. With that said, at level 100 we have the choices of Overpowered, Arcane Orb, or Prismatic Crystal. Now here is the second tier that comes back to your playstyle. primarily because this tier plays off of the 5th tier at level 75. So if you choose Supernova, like I did, Prismatic Crystal is your best choice. Prismatic Crystal basically allows you to drop a Prismatic Crystal on the ground, like so, that can only be targeted by you, the mage. And anytime you do damage to the Prismatic Crystal, like so, drop an Arcane Blast at it, boom, until it is destroyed. It will then release energy, dealing everything to all enemies around it within 8 yards. So it's a great AoE boost. Excuse me. If you chose Nether Tempest on the other side, again, with better gear and things of that nature, I'll probably switch over to that. Arcane Orb becomes more viable than Prismatic Crystal. I'll allow you a moment to check out the description of Arcane Orb. With talents taken care of, we'll switch over to glyphs. Now, in glyphs, there are a few things. There are several glyphs you could use. Minor glyphs, of course, are still cosmetic, so sticking to majors here. And as you can see, I'm only using one minor glyph. The only one that really makes any sense for the mage, which is Momentum, allowing your blink spell to teleport you in the direction you're moving rather than the direction you're facing. It's great for blinking in a strafe rather than blinking forward when you want to blink sideways. The major glyphs, on the other hand, like I said, there are several that you can choose from that are all viable. But for what I've used, Glyph of Arcane Power is the most straightforward. It increases the duration of Arcane Power by 100%, essentially doubling the duration of Arcane Power, but it also doubles the cooldown, which means you only use it half as often. The next one I used here was Arcane Explosion, which increases the radius and allows you to pull when mobs aren't stacking properly. Makes it a little harder for you, of course, if you don't. And last but not least, which was to me another no-brainer, Glyph of Slow, which means that my Arcane Blast now applies a slow to the target, which is extremely useful for solo targeting or for solo leveling and any type of encounters that you're on your own. Like I said, you want to burn them down before they get to you, so anytime you can slow them or stun them before they can reach you, you're better off. With that said, there's the idea of priority lists or rotations. Well, in this case, as a mage, you got to first know that an Arcane Mage uses Arcane Power. And the way that works is there are several of your abilities here that Arcane charges will affect. For instance, first of all, the Arcane Charge is a self-debuff that lasts 15 seconds and will stack up to 4 times. And what it does, essentially, is that it increases the amount of damage that you do from Arcane Power spells, but it also increases the mana cost of said powers. For instance, Arcane Blast will grant a stack of Arcane Charge, and each stack of Arcane Charge increases the damage that Arcane Blast does by 50%, but it also increases the mana cost by 100%, which means at 4 stacks, your Arcane Blast, which is currently, let me get back to it here, costs me 3,200 mana. With 4 stacks, that makes it what? What's 3,200 times 4? 12,800 or so? Quite a bit of mana. As you can see, that's nearly 10% easy. So obviously you're going to be playing with your Arcane Charges, stacking them up, using them, getting rid of them, stacking them up, burning through them. And to do that, there's a couple of ways. First of all, in single target damage, whereas you're against a raid boss or somebody, rare elite that has a lot of health points, for instance, it's a 2-phase concept. You've got your conserve phase, where you're basically going to drop your Rune of Power, hit them with your Supernova, hit them with Arcane Blast. Whenever you've got at least 3 charges of Arcane, you will use your Arcane Missiles. Otherwise, you're just basically using a lot of Arcane Blast. You don't really want to use the Arcane Barrage unless you have the full 4 stacks of Arcane Charge and you're trying to conserve your mana at this point. At which point, when you're ready to burn through in the second phase, you will maintain the same priority, except for you won't use Arcane Barrage, and you will essentially spam the crap out of Arcane Blast, eating through your mana. In a sense, you Rune of Power, Supernova, Arcane Blast, Arcane Blast, Arcane Blast, until you're down to 50% mana, at which point you're going to evocate to gain your mana back. And just as that evocate finishes off, where you're at 100% mana, hopefully you get 100% mana first, you will then go right back into Arcane Blast, Arcane Blast, Arcane Blast. At which point, once you're back down to about 50% mana, you will then switch back to your conserve phase and let it build back up while you slow down your DPS. In a situation where you're up against more than 4 targets and you're needing to do some AoE, basically what you're going to do is you're going to spam your Arcane Explosion and build your Arcane Charges. That way you can throw your Arcane Barrage with full stacks of Arcane Charge to help burn down quickly. You can also use your Cone of Cold if you've got that glyphed, which I did not, just because it's not really useful for my playstyle either way. With that said, the cooldowns you need to think about are, first of all, Arcane Power, like I mentioned, is your primary DPS cooldown. You want to use that when you're entering each and every burn phase for that extra DPS. Prismatic Crystal, as I mentioned, at Tier 7 talent, if you've chosen that, and Supernova with Tier 5 talent, since I chose that, is a very powerful AoE combo. And it's also, once you've got your Arcane Power started, that takes your top priority, meaning in a situation where you got 5 or more mobs, hit Arcane Power, drop your Prismatic Crystal, and beat the crap out of it with your Supernova twice, real fast. Followed by a Presence of Mind, which if I do this, you can see what that is, which basically means your next cast spell is now instant, which I would then use on Arcane Blast. And, of course, you still have all your other little abilities you can throw in there if you have cooldowns available. But for the most part, that takes care of just about everybody. Number one thing to know with a mage in Arcane spec is your mastery. Mastery for an Arcane Mage is Mana Adept, meaning that your spell damage is increased up to 35%, but it's based on the amount of mana that you have unspent. So if you have 100% mana, your damage is increased by 35%. If you're down to 50% mana, like I'd mentioned earlier in the burn phase, once you're down to 50% mana, your mastery is only going to increase your spell damage by 17.5%. And so on and so forth, all the way down to 10% mana, you'll only get 3.5%. So the idea is to maintain a high amount of mana at all times. Use this information, toy with it, play around. Like I said, it's only really a starting point. You can do so much more with it. The mage himself as a class has a lot of cool ideas, and on top of being an excellent damage dealer, they have quite a bit of utility. They can portal themselves everywhere. They can portal the whole party everywhere. They just have a lot at their fingertips. So with that, I think I'm going to wrap this video up. I appreciate you stopping by. Thanks for the likes. Comment down below if you have anything you'd like to mention or if anything I missed. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe. I'd like to see you some more. Thanks again and enjoy. Happy hunting. Bye.